Whenever something goes wrong in my swing or whenever I hit a bad shot, these are the first things I check. And the reason is these are like really big pillars of the swing. And so the little things like which way my hands are moving or, you know, did I come inside to out, all that stuff, a lot of that depends on did I nail these parts. So for example, coming like out to in, if I'm here, I'm much more likely to come out to in. So if I had a bad takeaway, if you look at the swings of really good golfers, you'll start to notice that they all basically have 3 big moves in common, which makes the majority of the swing work. And that's really good news for us because it means 1, if you nail these 3 things, you're 90% there. 2, whenever you have a problem with your swing, you're trying to figure out what went wrong, it's a great first thing to check. And number 3, if there's a swing change you've been trying to make and you know, for some reason you just can't make it work, your body's just to work that way, it might be because you're not doing one of these 3 things. And so your body isn't set up to be able to make that swing change you want. So what a dream, right? How fantastic. All right, I know what you're thinking. Enough suspense, let's go. Hey, what's up? I'm Manu. Welcome to the channel. So let's get going. And actually, I kind of almost lied, but it wasn't really a lie. My lawyer says it was not a lie because there's 4 things that matter, but only 3 of them are moves. So 3 moves and 1 setup, right? So actually that's the step 0 as we talk about this, and no, this would not be complete if I didn't talk about setup. So the first thing that's really, really important, if you have a bad setup, it's really hard to get into the other positions you need to get into. You know, if your arms are like fully turned or, you know, you've got some weird stance, it's just going to be really hard to make the rest of it work. So a simple mnemonic that I like to use is GSABB, which is grip, stance, alignment, ball position, and balance. So those are my 5 things that I check as far as my setup goes. You know, good grip, good stance. You want to be aligned to the target. If you're here, you're going to try to pull across your body. It's a whole problem. Don't do that, right? So grip, stance, alignment, ball position. You want the ball position in a good spot. You don't want too far back, too far forward. It's going to change swing dynamics. It's a problem. And then balance. For a lot of us amateurs, what we tend to do is we tend to be either on our toes or we tend to sit back on our heels. And then this causes problems as you start taking the backswing and stuff. So step 0, make sure you check that setup. But once you've done that, now we can move on to the first big move, which is a really good takeaway. And when I say really good takeaway, the 2 things I'm talking about really are not having the really far inside takeaway and then not doing a takeaway with the whole body, right? Where like your whole body starts turning and that causes the insideness as well. It's a whole problem. So the goal that you're looking for, and if you look at everyone's swings, Rory, Scotty, Tiger, everybody, what you'll notice is all of their takeaways are kind of nice and square. And so there's a bunch of different ways to do this. One of my favorites is a video by Eric Cagorno, and I've put that down in the description. You can check it out. It's my favorite one. It really helped me get good. And so thank you, Eric. If you're watching this, thank you. You have really helped my golf game. But let me tell you a little bit more about it now and the kind of 2 things I look for specifically when it comes to takeaway. So the first is you want to have a nice square takeaway where your hands don't open up too much. You don't want to be in this position here. Now, back in the day when I first learned to play golf, I learned that when you're at club shaft parallel, you should have your toe pointing to the sky. And this is the way I always used to do it. That's not the new school of thought when it comes to this. And I actually really like the new school because what it does is it keeps the club head in a really good position through most of the swing so that you don't have to manipulate it too much as you're coming down. So with the old one, if you were here and let's suppose you didn't really move your hands as you came through, the club face would be wide open. Versus with the new one, because you've got a little bit more square, you're a little more closed, a little more square, even if you didn't do very much with your hands, as you just turn your body to come through, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is dead on square and the ball is going to go that way, 350 yards probably. It's a wedge, so maybe like 340. But yeah, it's going to be perfect in the right direction. So that's the first thing that's really important. And there's a few different ways to think about this. I'll give you 2 quick ones that you can try. So the first one is as you take the club back at close to parallel, you kind of want the leading edge to be at more of like a 45 to 30 degree angle. Depending on which way you're looking at it. I think 30 degrees off of the vertical. So 30 to 45 degrees off the vertical. That's kind of where you want it to be. And a good way to check that is if you swing through without turning your hands, does it look square? Should be square. If it's too open, if you swing through without turning your hands, it'll be wide open. And so it just takes more variability out of the swing, right? That's helpful. The second way to check this is just to see kind of the position of your right hand and where it's facing throughout most of the takeaway. So as you're taking the club back to about here, just you want your right hand to still be pointing downwards or towards a target. So for as long as possible, right? So if my right hand was just here on its own, as I take the club back, it's pointing downwards or towards the target. Versus if I was doing this incorrectly and kind of bringing it inside. And let's be clear, just for all the disclaimers that apply here, you can still have a good swing if you have an inside takeaway. It's much harder. Like, it's really, really hard. There's a lot of extra work that's required for various reasons. You create a lot more variability. It's harder to line up. You got to get nail ball position. You got to get lucky. Like, all this stuff applies. So golf's hard enough as it is. Let's make it easier. This is one way to make it easier. And it's actually not that hard to change to do. So that's my recommendation, but You do you. It's all good. So back to the point. If your right hand is flat against the side of the grip, as you take the club back, you'll notice it either points towards the target or down. Versus if it was wide open, it'd be opening up. And so that's really just an easy check. And that'll fix kind of the face angle that we have here. And it'll also move you towards the second part of this, which is how do you take the club back? Like what direction do you take the club back in? For a lot of us, what we tend to do is we tend to take the club back inside. And so you might have like a decent, I guess, hand position, right? Or even like club head position. But if you're doing it too far inside, this is going to cause problems because you're going to get stuck on the inside here with your arm. It's not a good place to be. So instead, you want to make sure you're giving yourself plenty of space as you take the club back. And that you can do really easily. Here's a really simple drill or checkpoint, whatever works for you, is grab a club. You can grab a alignment rod ideally, but club's easy. So grab a club, put it in line with wherever you're going. And as you put the club head down and you take it back, just feel like it traces that line. And so for my eyes, what I'm seeing is basically my club head is going over this line here. It doesn't need to be super precise, it's close enough. I mean, the 2 millimeters here is not going to make a difference to your swing too much. So don't get too precise, but you want to make sure you're not here, right? And if you want, you can do the Jim Furyk, which it works. You create the shallowing, it's fine. But this is the part that we're trying to avoid, right? Another part of this takeaway that I think is really important, there's various schools of thought on this, but the majority of people do this. If you watch any of the pro tournaments, you'll see this happen when they analyze people's swings, is you'll notice the weight shift. And so for most pros, they tend to move their weight towards their back foot, right? So you might set up even 60-40, whatever it might be, but they tend to move their weight towards their back foot as they're starting to hit the ball. So easy place to see this are like Jack Nicklaus, Phil Mickelson, who actually like lift their feet. But even if you look at someone like Scotty or Rory or Tiger, or any of those guys, you'll notice that as they take the club back, there's a shift and they're effectively lifting up the outside of their left foot, or a different way, they're kind of taking the weight off of that. That's really important too. It sets you up for all the other stuff that we're going to do afterwards. So if you're here, and one of the problems amateurs we tend to have is as we take the club back, we don't actually move the weight back. And so right now you'll see is actually most of my weight's on my left side. This causes more problems. So what's going to end up happening is because my weight's on my left side, it's hard for me to drive and come down. And so the only way I'm going to fix that is I'm going to go fall back and try to hit that ball. It's not going to work real good. So I prefer to not have the weight shift or stay on the left side. There's schools of thought. There's something I heard about a while ago where there's a school of thought where you basically rotate everything around your left side. That's not what I work with, and I've not seen very many pros doing that. So they tend to do it at a really high level, and it works for them, and it's worked for me, so that's my suggestion. If you are one of those people who pivots around your left side, cool, great, drop me a message. I'd love to learn more. And then the second big thing that causes problems with the takeaway is when you do it with your whole body, really. And so I see this a lot with beginners is you're stepping up and then you basically start the whole swing with your left or your whole body, including your lower body. And so what happens is because you're doing this, you're very likely to be really far inside, right? It also causes a whole bunch of problems on the downswing because you can't create that same power because you don't have tension between your lower body and upper body, coiled spring effect. We could talk about that for days, but we won't right now. But I think that part's really important. So as you take the club back with this takeaway, and when you do the Eric Cogorno video, I highly recommend it. It's really that good. I get no money from that. It's really that good. I just get satisfaction of knowing that you guys will play better golf. So there you go. And so the simple fix to that is don't do that. I'm being facetious here, but you know where I'm getting at. Really, like don't move the lower body so much. Like start the swing with your hands, or start the swing of the club head effectively. I prefer less to think about like my hands, my shoulders, all these other things. Instead, I just kind of want to start the swing here with the club head. I'm just taking the club head back to here. I'm not trying to move my whole body to make that happen. So keep the lower body a little bit still at the beginning for sure. In the video down below that I mentioned with Eric Cogorno, he mentions that he has a drill that you can use with an alignment stick. And that'll help you kind of figure out that really you don't need to move that lower body too much until you get to probably about here. There's a tiny bit, but not too much. And that'll also help you create the tension between the upper body, lower body, get more power. You'll have probably a shorter swing, which is easier to control. A lot of other great things coming from that. Now let's move on to move number 2, which is really about creating space in the downswing. And this is, I think, the most important thing for a lot of us. Actually, it's the second most important, third most important, whatever. Setup's important, takeaway is really important, creating space in the downswing is also very important. So All very important things. Just write them down somewhere, tattoo them somewhere. Maybe it'll be helpful. The point I mean with making space in the downswing is really getting your left hip out of the way. So for a right-handed golfer, obviously, getting your leading hip out of the way. And the reason really is as you look at it, what we tend to do for most of us, we tend to generate power through sliding. Right? There's 3 ways to generate power. I'm sure there's more, but the 3 that I know of. So one is you can use your hands, which is what we all do. We're trying to swing so hard. That's the generating power with the arms, just like swing harder. The second way that we tend to do it is you have some lateral movement, and we all want some lateral movement because you're shifting your weight towards that left side or pressure towards that left side. And the third way is rotational, which is actually the most powerful way because you're using your bigger muscles, your core, etc. And if you think about it, like if you're throwing in American football, right? So you're back here, you wind up, you take a big wind up, and then you rotate everything to really get that ball all the way out there. So it's basically what we're trying to do. And for most of us as amateurs, what we tend to do is we tend to take the club back and then we slide. And now everything's going wrong because there's no space for the hands to move. And because there's no space for the hands to come through, we have to do other things to compensate because the brain knows, I got to hit this ball, otherwise I'm gonna look like a chump. And so the brain's like, I will do whatever's necessary to hit that ball. And so the brain compensates by doing things like early extension, right? You're here, you might try to stand up so you have room to move your hands through. Or maybe you're like cutting against the ball, you're hitting these hooks. There's all these ways you're gonna compensate, which are not gonna move the ball the way that you want it to go or wherever you want it to go. So let's not do that and let's do something better instead, which is getting the left hip out of the way so that there's more space to hit the ball. And there's a bunch of different ways of thinking about this. I'll throw out a couple or 3 of them actually, because everyone learns differently and different things resonate for different people. So as a total aside, that's kind of my journey as I look at getting better about golf is often I listen to the same topic, but from different people because there's some words that just click. So I'm going to throw out a few different ways and hopefully one of these will click for you. So the first way is what I learned from watching Tiger. There's a great video of him critiquing amateur swings and he talks about it very clearly there, which is as you take the club back, load up on your right side. Now on your downswing, you move this left hip straight back. And so for him, the move is this hip goes basically straight back. He doesn't think about rotation, or at least I don't think he thinks about rotation. It just goes straight back and that creates that space for him. So now you got lots of room. You're not sliding and stuck. You've got lots of room to hit that ball. So that's one way of thinking about it. So as you take the club back and load up your right side, now this hip just moves straight back. Another way to frame it is the way Padraig Harrington talks about it, which is because you're trying to move this hip, well, what's that hip connected to? It's connected to the other hip, which is connected to the leg. And so what you can do to try to get this hip to move back is you can move this leg forward, right? You get the opposite effect. And so if you're moving this knee, your right knee or trailing knee towards your lead toe, right? You'll actually notice, I'll do it for you here. You'll notice if you're moving this in that direction, it'll turn on its own, right? Especially if you're allowing this leg to straighten. So it's another cue that's useful if, it's harder to think about having that hip move straight back. You can just think about, okay, as I come here, I'm moving this knee in this direction and that'll do that work on its own of getting my hip to move. So another easy way to do it. My favorite way to do it is actually something I figured out on my own and then Xander talked about it. So I was like, yes, validation, which is I tend to move the weight into my left heel. And so it's more pressure, not weight fully. We'll talk about the next move number 3. But the core point here is as I'm here and I'm stepping up to the ball, as I move back, I load up my right toe. So the ball of the foot, my big toe on my right side. So the ball of the foot, which is right about here. And so gotta work on that balance, geez. So what I'm doing is, as I take the club back, I'm loading that side up. And then from here, I'm actually gonna drive into the left heel. And so I actually don't mind if the foot kind of moves, but because I'm driving into the left heel, the only way I can do that is it's hard for me to drive into the left heel and slide. The only way I can drive to the left heel is if the left hip moves back. I hope that makes sense, right? It's really hard to move the weight into your left heel on its own without making this hip go backwards. And so that helps me hit the ball the way I want to hit it. So let's hit one so I can show you kind of how I think about it and how I act on it. So good takeaway that we just talked about with the weight shift. And then as we come through, so that weight shift is going to move, but it's going to move into the left leg and the left heel basically. Try another one. Yeah. Okay. So I thought the sim might have some problems because there's some tears in the screen. We'll get those fixed, but I thought the sim might have some problems, but I guess not. Apparently my wedge did actually launch that high, and that's actually the distance I usually hit it. I usually hit it about 125, 130. So yeah, look, it works. Perfect. Mostly straight, tiny bit of draw. Hey, what else can you ask for? And so to summarize this move, because it's so important, as we take the club back, we want to now create space on the downswing for the arms to come through and hit the ball. And that comes from getting that left hip out of the way. Now, for most of us, and this is something I think we all should really think about a little bit, is how much are you sliding? If you're sliding a lot, especially if the weight's starting to come to the outside of your leading foot, that's going to be a problem because now you're also off balance, right? It's not a great place to be, and there's not a lot of room because your arms are going to get stuck. So as much as possible, you can try that. If it's really hard to do that, another way you can compensate in the short term is just drop your left foot back a little bit. And so it feels like a really open stance, but as long as you keep your arms moving in the right plane, you should still be able to, let's try one now. So really like fairly wide open. As long as you keep your arms moving in the same plane, you should still be able to hit the shot basically in the direction you want to go. Yeah, still straight. That was actually almost straighter than the last one. Maybe I should do this. 150, holy cow, what? That's a problem. Something's going on. Anyway, guess I'm using an open stance from now on. That's the answer. So yeah, there you go. Hack, who knew? I gotta change the title of this video. But seriously, just this is so important. I can't like emphasize it enough. It happens so often. I play golf with a lot of like higher handicappers, and it's so easy to see. I used to do this all the time. It causes so many problems just being over that. So if you can create space, it will change your life, right? Along with move number 3, which is moving your pressure to the left side, but not all your weight. And that's a fancy way of saying keep your head back. And so actually, if you watch all the pros, and I'll put up some photos here, if you just Google, pick your favorite golfer impact position from the face on, you'll notice all of them as they're hitting the ball. So if the ball's here, as all of them as they're hitting the ball, their head is actually behind the ball. And most of them kind of like either turn their head a little bit or tilt it a little bit, but their head is behind the ball. And that makes sense, right? Like imagine if you're hammering a nail, right? Your head's always behind whatever thing you're hitting with. And that makes perfect sense when you think about other sports too, right? So, you know, you're playing basketball, you're shooting from in front of yourself, right? So the ball's here, it's not back here. It's really hard to hit good shots if your hands are like over your head or too far back. And the same thing applies when you're basically playing any other sport. So baseball too, you're throwing the ball kind of out here. Tennis, if you're gonna hit anything, you want it to be in front of you, behind you causes a lot of problems. But the problem that we have as golfers is because we just talked about this, because you're sliding, right? We're all sliding back here. Even if we're getting this hip out of the way, but we're sliding too much, now your head's just generally gonna be past the ball. And so an easy thing you can do is just feel like you're keeping your head back or move your head back. And so how to operationalize this is when you're on the course or when you're on the range, ideally you wanna try this on the range first. And so one of the things I do with the folks I'm teaching this is, you know, you set up, you get your good setup, step 0, very important. So you get your good setup, etc. And then either I'll hold a club or something to their head and I'll just be like, make sure A, when you're getting started, your head's not past the ball. You don't want to start past the ball because now it's gonna be really hard to get behind it. So you kind of want the ball in line with ideally your left ear or your leading ear, right? Or your eye, like, but around here, you don't want to be too far over the ball. For some folks, they want, you know, with their nose, it's not gonna matter that much, right? A couple millimeters here or there, not the worst, as long as you're not too far past the ball. So make sure you're set up good. I'll hold up a club or something to their head and I'll be like, just keep your head here. Do everything else, keep your head here. And that's it. So then you just feel like you're keeping your head there as you're making the rest of your swing. So we'll just do that here. Good takeaway, weight shift, get the hip out of the way and keep the head back. Head here. And it's actually fairly easy. You get a lot of power out of it. That was a decent amount of power. That's my normal kind of 130, 125 yard swing. It wasn't the 150 I got from the previous one, so I gotta work on that. But anyway, it's really easy, and I'm sure there's a few questions out there. I'll explain a little bit more about this. So the first one, for some folks, when they put their head back, they kind of leave their weight on their right side. Don't do that. It's really important, right? So the key point there is and this is something I learned from my buddy Ollie. So thank you, Ollie, who's also my nemesis, but it's okay. Thank you, Ollie, where he really taught me about you want to move your pressure but not your mass. And so what we tend to do, mass being all your weight, right? So what we tend to do as amateurs is as we move into hitting the ball, as we get to the left side, right? We move everything, which includes the head. And also generally when you move the head like this, because your head's leaning over a little bit, You know, your center of gravity is not back here. Your center of gravity is kind of somewhere around here. As you move that over, you also get into the left toe or your leading toe, which means you're not in the heel, which means you're not getting the space. See, notice how I said at the beginning how like these things cause all the other problems to happen. And so if you fix this, the other ones are less likely to happen. There's an example right there. Anyway, thank you all. One of my favorite analogies for this is ice hockey. If you ever watch people playing hockey, you'll notice that like really good on the NHL. If you watch them kind of at like ice level, you'll notice that their lower bodies operate basically independently of their upper body. And so that's the kind of way I like to think about it, right? So they're stick handling, but their legs are going like, you know, all over the place. That was a very accurate representation, but you know what I'm saying, right? So anyway, so that is one way I think about pressure versus mass is I'm kind of letting my lower body do its own thing while my upper body gives me the stability of like controlling the club face and keeps my head back so I can really launch into that shot. And if you don't want to think about pressure versus mass, it's just an easy, really easy thing you can try beyond the like keep your head back situation is go extreme on that end. So one thing I've been trying, and you can try it too if it helps you, is think about as you come down, you're actually going to move your head back as you hit the ball. You'll get a little bit more height on that launch, but if you move the rest of your body well and you don't get stuck on your back foot, it'll actually be a pretty good shot. So let's try it now. Why not? So good takeaway. So 3 moves, we're gonna try it. So 0, good setup, reasonable setup, right? Good takeaway, get that hip out of the way, and I'm actually gonna drop my head back as I hit this. See how it goes. And so I hope you could see me. I definitely felt myself like moving farther back. Distance was actually pretty solid. I kind of missed it a tiny bit to the right-hand side, but not terrible. I don't know, a yard, 2 yards. Was that a miss even? That graph says it wasn't. Look at how critical we are. Isn't this crazy? Critical for no reason. That shot was fine. 140 yards with a pitching wedge, like, yeah, so it does work. So the head shift and keeping your head back as you kind of hit, you know, into the, imagine throwing a punch, hitting a tennis ball, whatever it might be, keeping that head back is really important. So those are the 3 moves and the setup, of course, that we talked about. But there's 2 other things I think are really important. I mentioned them at the beginning of the video. The first is whenever something goes wrong in my swing or whenever I hit a bad shot, these are the first things I check. And the reason is, as you can tell from the other stuff we just talked about, these are like really big pillars of the swing. And so the little things like which way my hands are moving or, you know, did I come inside to out, all that stuff, a lot of that depends on did I nail these parts. So for example, coming like out to in, right? If I'm here, I'm much more likely to come out to in. So if I had a bad takeaway, I'm much more likely to come out to in. So instead of thinking about, oh, I was out to in or whatever, I check, oh, how was my takeaway on that? Was my takeaway good? Am I noticing or thinking about my takeaway? Or, you know, am I tight and so I'm making a bad takeaway today? All those things tend to apply. So I highly recommend, if you have a chance, like there's only 3 things, like our memory can hold 3 things. These 3 I think are really important just to remember. And they're the first things I would recommend everybody checks whenever you hit a bad shot. Is did I have a good takeaway? Did I create space with my left side? And did I keep my head behind the ball? And you can call them different things if you want, whatever floats your boat, pressure, mass, you know, hip sliding back, whatever you want to call it. But those 3 things are super important. The second part to that, which kind of extends onto that, is maybe you're trying to make a swing change right now and it's not working and you're like, I just can't get this right. Now, you didn't ask for my opinion on this, but since I'm here, why not? So whenever I'm trying to make some kind of a swing change or fix something, the first question I like to ask is, what do the conditions need to be in order for this thing to work? So a simple example for that is like, let's say you're trying to shallow the club more. Great, that's a really good thing. You know, you shallow the club, you can create more power, all this other stuff. But if you're trying to shallow the club and your hands are already too far inside, it's really hard to shallow it. You can, but you're gonna have trouble hitting the ball. And so what needs to be true in order for me to be able to shallow the club is I need to be in a good place where my hands can actually drop and shallow, right? And I call this shallowing, hopefully everybody else calls it shallowing too. Maybe you refer to it differently, but you know what I'm trying to get at. Or let's do another example. Let's suppose you're trying to work on your weight shift, but your weight shift has you out here. You know, this is your setup. If you're trying to do some weight shift, but your setup is a little too squat, there's too many other issues, your arm's too extended, etc. This is what comes before that weight shift happens. And that's going to cause problems, right? Because your starting point is not great. And so if you take one step before the thing you're trying to do and make sure that's correct, and so effectively, and the one before that and so on, effectively what I'm trying to say is you want to, whatever change you're trying to make, you want to make sure that the foundation before that change also works. Otherwise that change is just going to be really frustrating. It's going to take you forever. It's not going to work. All these other things are going to happen. And so that's where these 3 moves really kick in, because these are like 3 big pillars, cornerstones, insert building term here, that you can use to make the whole thing work. And so for me, really, I really just think about these three things. I have a couple like little ones I'm thinking about. Like for me right now, I'm working on like getting into my right side, really pushing on that toe, like I mentioned, left side there, and I want to have more club face control. But those are tiny things. Those are little things that come after these first three whenever I'm checking whatever went wrong. So summarize. A, 0, have a good setup, really important. 1 is making sure you take the club back along the target line, keeping your hands more kind of facing down and towards the target, and have that 30 to 45 degree angle. And the second is you don't do it with your whole body. That's going to cause problems, right? And obviously with that comes in the weight shift. So you're taking it back, you're having the weight shift, etc. Move number 2 is making sure you get that left hip out of the way as you're bringing that downswing in. And we talked about the 3 ways to do that with the hip, the knee, the weight shift. So those are really important. Just making sure there's lots of space. That'll fix the early extension problems. It'll fix a lot of other issues that we have. Good takeaway, and just those two will fix a lot of things. And then the third one was keeping the head back, or moving pressure, not mass, or whatever other fancy term you'd like to use, but effectively keeping the head back as you hit the ball. And so if we do those 3 things, a lot of the other stuff kind of works itself out, including like the shaking hands with the target, including like not having too long a backswing because you've got a good takeaway. It's unlikely you're going to be here to make everything else work. So it's just really, I can't tell you how useful these 3 moves are. Actually, I have. I've spent the last several minutes telling you they are super useful. I hope they're really helpful for you. Please let me know what you think of these. Please use the buttons and the comments and stuff. I'd love to hear. And if you can share this with your friends or subscribe, etc. I'm a small channel. I'm trying to grow it. I'd love your help. That would be really great. So thank you. I hope this is helpful. See you again soon. Bye.